Here's a sentence that sounds almost impossible in 2026. China says it has built a supercomputer powerful enough to challenge the most advanced machines on Earth, and without using a single GPU. No Nvidia accelerators, no AMD graphics processors, no secret stockpile of foreign AI chips hidden behind closed doors. Nothing that the entire technology industry has spent the last decade treating as absolutely essential. If you've followed artificial intelligence, supercomputing, or even the stock market recently, you already know why that sounds so strange. GPUs have become the engines of modern computing. They train the world's most advanced AI systems. They power scientific simulations. They sit at the center of virtually every machine, competing for a place among the fastest computers ever built. The rise of AI created a simple assumption that almost nobody questioned. If you want the most powerful computer on Earth, you need GPUs. China just challenged that assumption. The machine at the center of this story is called Lian Shen, and whether it ultimately proves every claim attached to it or not, its existence reveals something far bigger than a benchmark score. Because this isn't really a story about a computer. It's a story about what happens when a country loses access to the technology everyone else depends on and decides to find another way forward. And before we dive in, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told that success is impossible without a specific tool, a specific advantage, or a specific opportunity, and only to discover later that there was another path all along? If that idea resonates with you, let me know in the comments. I genuinely read through them, and some of the most thoughtful conversations on this channel start with simple questions like that. Because what happened here may be one of the most fascinating examples of that principle we've seen in modern technology. By the end of this video, you'll understand what Lian Shen actually is, why building it without GPUs may have been the entire objective from the beginning, why many experts remain skeptical of some of the headlines, and why this machine could represent something much more important than simply being fast. The deeper story isn't about breaking records. It's about rewriting the rules of the race itself. Part 1 will continue after your instruction. The first thing we need to do is separate the headline from the reality, because those are not necessarily the same thing. When people hear the words world's fastest supercomputer, they usually imagine a giant machine sitting in a secure government laboratory somewhere, humming away behind locked doors, while scientists run simulations that would take ordinary computers thousands of years to complete. That's not entirely wrong, but it also doesn't come close to capturing the scale of what we're talking about. Modern supercomputers operate in a world where numbers become almost meaningless. Their performance is measured in flops, which stands for floating point operations per second. In simple terms, that's the number of calculations a machine can perform every second. And the fastest computers on Earth are now operating at what's known as the exascale level. 1 exaflop equals 1 billion calculations every second. It's such a large number that our brains struggle to visualize it. Imagine every person alive on Earth sitting in front of a calculator and solving a math problem every single second without stopping. Even then, the combined effort of humanity would still fall dramatically short of what these machines accomplish in the blink of an eye, and these aren't machines built for ordinary tasks. But nobody spends billions of dollars building an exascale supercomputer so they can browse social media faster. And these systems are designed to tackle the hardest problems humanity can throw at them. They model climate systems decades into the future. They simulate nuclear reactions. They search for new materials. They help researchers understand diseases. They accelerate scientific discoveries that would otherwise take generations. Increasingly, they also play a central role in artificial intelligence, and this is why the race matters. The nation with the most powerful computing infrastructure gains more than bragging rights. It gains scientific advantages, technological advantages, economic advantages, and in some cases, strategic advantages that can influence the balance of power for years to come. That's why countries invest enormous resources into building these machines. And that's why China's announcement immediately captured global attention. Because, according to reports, Lian Shen is designed to reach approximately 2 exaflops of performance. If achieved and independently verified, that would place it among the most powerful supercomputers ever created. But here's where the story becomes unusual. Actually, unusual isn't the right word. The right word is unexpected, because nearly every expert looking at modern supercomputing would make the same assumption before seeing the design. They would assume it uses GPUs, lots of them, tens of thousands of them. That's because GPUs have become the undisputed champions of parallel computation. To understand why, think of the difference between a master craftsman and an army of workers. A CPU, the traditional processor found in laptops and servers, is like a highly skilled specialist. It can handle complicated tasks, make decisions, switch between different jobs, and adapt to changing situations. A GPU is different. A GPU is like a massive workforce performing thousands of similar operations simultaneously. One worker isn't particularly impressive, but when 10,000 workers all perform the same operation at the same time, extraordinary things become possible. That is exactly why GPUs became the foundation of modern AI. Training an advanced language model requires staggering amounts of repetitive mathematical computation. GPUs excel at this. Scientific simulations often involve millions or billions of calculations being performed. Simultaneously, GPUs excel at this too. Over time, the entire high-performance computing industry evolved around this reality. The fastest machines began using more GPUs. The largest AI systems required more GPUs. The biggest technology companies bought more GPUs. Governments wanted more GPUs. Everyone wanted more GPUs. And one company, Nvidia, found itself sitting at the center of that global demand. The story became so familiar that it eventually turned into an assumption: need more computing power, add more GPUs. Need a faster AI system, add more GPUs. Need a world-class supercomputer, definitely add more GPUs. Then China announced Lian Shen, and suddenly people started asking a very simple question. Wait, if there are no GPUs, then what exactly is powering this thing? That's where things get interesting, and according to publicly discussed information, Lian Shen relies primarily on massive numbers of CPUs working together. Not a few hundred, not a few thousand, tens of thousands of them. And when engineers around the world heard that, many had the same reaction. Why deliberately choose the harder route? Why ignore the technology everyone else depends on? Why build the machine differently when the existing formula already works? And those questions lead us directly to the real heart of this story, because the answer has very little to do with engineering preferences and almost everything to do with geopolitics. Over the past several years, the global semiconductor industry has become one of the most strategically important sectors in the world. Advanced chips are no longer viewed simply as commercial products. They are increasingly viewed as national assets. As a result, restrictions on advanced semiconductor exports became tighter and tighter. The most powerful AI accelerators, especially those produced by Nvidia, became significantly harder for China to obtain. From one perspective, the goal was straightforward: limit access to advanced chips, limit access to advanced computing power, slow technological progress. Whether you agree with that strategy or disagree with it, one thing became clear: China could no longer assume unlimited access to the exact hardware that everyone else was using. And that's when a fascinating shift began to happen. Instead of asking, how do we get more GPUs? And the question gradually became, what if we stop depending on them entirely? That question may sound simple, but it changes everything, because once dependence becomes a vulnerability, independence becomes a strategic objective. And if you've been following China's technology sector recently, you've probably noticed this pattern appearing again and again. Whether it's semiconductors, manufacturing equipment, operating systems, artificial intelligence, aerospace technology, or advanced computing, the same philosophy keeps emerging. Build domestically, control the supply chain, reduce external dependence, create alternatives. Sometimes those alternatives are better, sometimes they're worse, sometimes they take years to mature, but the objective remains the same. And that's what makes Lian Shen so fascinating. The machine isn't merely trying to be fast. It's trying to prove something. It's trying to demonstrate that world-class computing can be achieved using an entirely different path. And before we go further, I want to pause for a second and hear your perspective. Do you think technological restrictions ultimately slow innovation, or do they sometimes force people to become even more creative? I'm genuinely curious because reasonable people disagree on this question. Some of the most insightful comments I've ever read came from viewers sharing experiences from their own industries where limitations ended up producing unexpected breakthroughs. And if you're enjoying this deep dive so far, consider subscribing, not because numbers matter, not because channels need subscribers, but because if you're the kind of person who enjoys looking beyond headlines and understanding the deeper forces shaping the future, then you're exactly the reason these conversations exist in the first place. Because what comes next may be the most important part of the entire story. Building a GPU-free supercomputer is one thing. Actually making it competitive with the world's best machines is something else entirely. And that's where China's engineers appear to have attempted something that almost nobody expected. A completely different route to the summit, and whether it succeeds or fails may tell us far more about the future of computing than any benchmark score ever could. And the challenge, however, was never simply building a large machine. Anyone with enough money can connect thousands of processors together. The real challenge is making them behave like a single intelligence. And this is where supercomputing becomes less about raw hardware and more about orchestration. Imagine trying to conduct an orchestra with 47,000 musicians. Not 47,000. Every instrument must enter at exactly the right moment. Every section must remain synchronized. Every delay creates inefficiency. Every communication bottleneck wastes precious performance. Now imagine attempting that coordination billions of times every second. That's the problem engineers face when designing modern supercomputers. The larger the machine becomes, the harder coordination becomes. In fact, many supercomputing experts will tell you that adding processors is often the easy part. The difficult part is preventing those processors from spending half their time waiting for each other, because a processor that's waiting isn't computing. And a supercomputer filled with waiting processors is like a traffic jam made of silicon. This is one reason GPUs became so dominant. Their architecture naturally excels at handling enormous volumes of parallel workloads. And without GPUs, engineers must find entirely different ways to achieve similar levels of performance. According to reports surrounding Lian Shen, that meant rethinking several parts of the traditional supercomputing design. The processors themselves reportedly incorporate high-bandwidth memory technologies designed to reduce one of the oldest bottlenecks in computing, data movement. Most people think processors spend their time calculating. Often they spend surprising amounts of time waiting for information, waiting for instructions, waiting for memory access, waiting for data to arrive from somewhere else. Every millisecond spent waiting is performance that disappears. So one strategy is simple. Bring memory closer, move information faster, reduce the distance between data and computation. It sounds obvious, but at exascale levels, even tiny improvements can translate into enormous gains. Then comes networking, because once you have tens of thousands of processors operating simultaneously, communication becomes just as important as computation. Think of a sports team. Talent matters, but communication matters too. A team filled with elite athletes that cannot coordinate effectively will often lose to a team that moves as one. The same principle applies to supercomputers. Individual processors may be powerful, but if they cannot exchange information efficiently, overall performance suffers dramatically. Reports suggest that Lian Shen relies on an extraordinarily large interconnection system designed to move vast quantities of data between components every second. That networking infrastructure may end up being one of the most important pieces of the entire machine. Because in modern supercomputing, speed isn't just about how fast processors think, it's about how fast they talk. And then there's heat, a challenge that rarely receives headlines despite being one of the biggest obstacles in advanced computing. Every calculation generates heat. Every processor generates heat. Multiply that across tens of thousands of chips, and the problem becomes enormous. At a certain scale, heat isn't merely an inconvenience. It's an enemy. Too much heat reduces performance. Too much heat damages components. Too much heat can make entire systems unstable. This is why many of the world's fastest computers rely on advanced liquid cooling systems. Lian Shen reportedly follows the same philosophy. Instead of relying solely on air cooling, liquid carries heat away far more efficiently, allowing processors to operate at higher performance levels for longer periods. Taken together, these design choices suggest something important. This isn't a random collection of processors assembled to make a political statement. There appears to be genuine engineering ambition behind the project. Real technical effort, real innovation, real attempts to solve difficult problems. And that's precisely why the discussion around Lian Shen deserves more nuance than many headlines provide. Because there are actually two completely different questions being asked. Question number one, is Lian Shen truly the fastest supercomputer in the world? Question number two, has China demonstrated a viable path toward world-class computing without GPUs? Those questions sound similar. They're not, and confusing them leads to a lot of misunderstanding. Let's address the first question honestly. The claim that Lian Shen is already the fastest supercomputer on Earth remains heavily debated. A crucial distinction exists between projected performance and verified performance. In the world of supercomputing, benchmarks matter. Independent verification matters. Measured results matter. A machine doesn't become the fastest simply because someone predicts that it will be. It becomes the fastest when the performance is demonstrated, tested, measured, and confirmed. That's why many experts have been cautious, not dismissive, not hostile, just cautious, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. At the time many of these reports emerged, some of the most attention-grabbing numbers were still targets rather than fully verified achievements. And that's an important distinction. It's the difference between saying, we built the fastest car in the world, and saying, we believe this car will become the fastest once testing is complete. Those are very different statements. But here's what fascinates me. Even if the most ambitious headline turns out to be exaggerated, the deeper story remains incredibly significant. Because the second question may ultimately matter far more than the first. Can China build elite computing systems without relying on foreign GPUs? For years, many people assumed the answer was no. The logic seemed straightforward. The most advanced AI chips came from elsewhere. The most advanced accelerators came from elsewhere. The industry's dominant architecture depended on technologies China couldn't freely access. And therefore, limitations would eventually become barriers. That was the assumption. Lian Shen challenges that assumption, not necessarily by proving complete victory, but by proving that alternatives exist, and sometimes proving an alternative exists is enough to change the entire conversation. Because once a path exists, it can be improved, refined, scaled, optimized, and repeated. This is where the story becomes bigger than one machine. much bigger, and what we're really witnessing may be the early stages of technological divergence. For years, much of the world pursued similar computing strategies, similar architectures, similar hardware ecosystems, similar supply chains. Now those paths are beginning to separate. Different countries are building different stacks, different chip ecosystems, different software ecosystems, different approaches to solving the same problems, and history suggests that technological competition often produces unexpected outcomes. The winning solution isn't always the one experts predict at the beginning. Sometimes constraints create innovation. Sometimes scarcity creates efficiency. Sometimes obstacles force entirely new approaches. And sometimes the solution nobody expected becomes the one everyone studies later. That's why I find Lian Shen so interesting, not because it proves China has already won some grand technological contests, and not because it proves everyone else is falling behind. And neither conclusion is supported by the evidence, and what fascinates me is what this machine represents. It represents determination. It represents adaptation. It represents the willingness to challenge assumptions that many people considered settled, and regardless of where you stand politically, technologically, or economically, there's something undeniably interesting about that. One of the reasons I enjoy making videos like this is because they remind us how often the future surprises us. The future rarely arrives exactly the way experts predict. The technologies people laugh at sometimes become essential. The technologies people assume are unbeatable sometimes get replaced, and the paths that look impossible sometimes become reality. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear where you're watching from, not for an algorithm, not for statistics, just because it's genuinely incredible seeing people from different countries and different backgrounds gathering around the same conversation about technology and the future. Every time I scroll through those comments, and I'm reminded how global these stories really are.